Well, good afternoon. Welcome and thanks for joining us for this Zoom meeting. My name is Joel Ani. I'm Executive Director of WASA. The purpose of this afternoon's meeting is to provide an overview of the newly adopted emergency rules for graduation requirements. We are pleased to have Randy Spalding, Executive Director of the State Board of Education, with us today to provide this overview. If you have questions along the way, we encourage you to submit them through the chat box. And as time allows, today Randy will endeavor to answer those questions. Randy, thanks so much for making yourself available to share with the WASA membership today. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
He needs to unmute.
Thank you, Joel. I was working on my PowerPoint and I forgot to unmute, so thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the emergency credit waiver program. I recognize a lot of folks on the call. We had a number of calls and other engagements to try to get feedback as we were developing these, and it's hard to believe it was only over about a 3-week period. So we are pleased to now have rules and now have an application available for districts to apply for this, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we go through this. My hope today is just to give some broad overview. We're going to highlight key definitions that are in the rules, talk a little bit about the application process, and then how the waiver can be used, and then see what questions you have. But if folks want some clarifying information along the way, that's absolutely welcome. So just to start off, I think it's helpful just to start with the board. So this is the State Board of Education. It's a 16-member board. Many are elected by local school boards, and then or by others. So our private school rep is elected by the private schools. Our 2 student members are elected by students. And then we have 7 appointed by the governor as well. And of course, the state superintendent is statewide elected. So that is our board, and they met yesterday. We had all of the members of our board on that, and we had a unanimous decision to adopt the rules that we're going to be talking about today. So just to start off the context, towards the end of the session, it became clear that we were going to have a pretty significant disruption in our education system, but statewide closures had not yet happened. And so we wanted to be prepared and create some additional flexibility if possible. And as folks in the field know, we have a fair amount of flexibility in how we determine whether or not a student has met the state's graduation requirements and how they can earn credit. What we don't have a lot of flexibility for is waiving requirements or waiving credits or reducing credits that are required for graduation. And we're concerned that we would be coming into a situation where those tools might be necessary, and I think that's become more apparent in recent times. That said, the goal is still to try to get students to earn the credit where possible, and then to have this flexibility as a backup when students are not able to earn credit. So that's the broad context. This did require legislation in order to give the board authority to pass on this authority to districts. In that legislation, an application process is required, and so that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. And then districts do need to make a good faith effort to address those course requirements, both core and elective requirements. And students also, this really only addresses those students who are planning to graduate this year. So students who are on track to graduate with the class of 2020. And I'll again talk a little bit more about how those things are defined in just a moment. And then there's an additional provision for private schools around hour and day requirements. Hours and days for the public institutions are a matter that goes to the superintendent's office rather than the state board. So I mentioned the timeline. So the initial declaration of emergency from the governor was on February 29th, and then school buildings were closed on March 13th. And then the governor signed this bill on the 17th. It was actually passed by the legislature on the 12th of March. And so we had a special board meeting very shortly after to talk about the parameters, what should the rules look like, what were the considerations as we were developing these. And then we did some outreach through the associations to get feedback on an initial draft of rules that came out last week. And then over the weekend, we revised our draft rules and sent that out as part of our public meeting materials on Monday. And we made an additional revision at the special board meeting yesterday after some further clarification about, we had a concern about the authority for this ends on July 31st. And so we had been interpreting that to mean that we could not include students who were completing their studies during summer. But we did some additional research and got some further clarification on that, so that we determined we could, in fact, include those students. And so that was the change that happened between Monday and Wednesday of this week. And I didn't update this. The rules were adopted and are effective and have been filed. I'm not actually sure they've gone through the entire process with the Code Advisor's Office, but we also launched our application today. So we're ahead of the timeline we had put in here. We wanted to make sure it was available at least by the 15th of April. It is available today, and we have so far received 14 applications from districts, most of which are complete, and a couple which we have a couple of questions on. It is a pretty straightforward application. We will collect those, review those, and post information about those applications on our website, and then the board will review them at a special board meeting on the 21st. It is the board's intention after that meeting to have those approved at the staff level on a rolling basis. So I'll be doing those approvals after the meeting on the 21st. And so that's broad framework. The rules are available on our website and in their entirety. There are 5 sections to the rules. Broad authority to purpose really kind of outlines what I talked about just a moment ago. I'm going to go through the 2 terms that we define, on track and good faith effort, and then talk about the application process and and then how you use the waiver, what can and cannot be waived, and what that process looks like. I'm not going to go into private schools today. If folks have questions about that, I can answer them, but I didn't plan to address those with this audience. So that definition of on track, there's a little bit of guidance in the legislation on this, that the student has to have been a student that was planning to complete this school year, and that gets at that issue that I mentioned a moment ago, where we had been interpreting this as essentially a spring graduate, because the authorization for this waiver expires on the 31st of July, and summer term extends into August. But again, with some additional clarification, we were able to determine that if a student was completing in summer, it's just that any waivers for that student have to be granted prior to the expiration of the authority. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. So the student has to be on track to graduate. That means that they either have, when you add up the courses they've already completed and what they were enrolled in, and what they had planned to enroll in, that those would have to meet the state minimum requirements. And the initial conceptualization was this sort of the enrolled plus completed, but we know that in some systems, students may not have been enrolled yet. If they were, say, for example, in Running Start or in a trimester system back in February, they might not have started, they wouldn't have been expected to have started their spring courses yet. And then adding summer further complicates that. So it's that plan plus the courses that they've already completed or are already enrolled in would need to add up to meeting at least the state minimum requirements. And then we do ask that, that what do we mean by planned? We mean courses that are in the high school and beyond plan that students registered for, but maybe hadn't started yet, or that it's part of credit attainment or credit recovery plan. So and it's the district's determination as to whether or not the student is on track. Next term is the good faith effort. So good faith effort is, we tied this to the guidance that OSPI has been providing about providing service to students in the time of building closures, as well as the specific guidance around seniors and how to help them earn or achieve credit. And so that memo 2220 includes a number of strategies that a district might employ, and things like competency-based crediting, examining alternative grade options, using course equivalencies, those sorts of things are the types of things that are pointed to in that memo. And so for the school district to receive the authority to use the waiver, they must certify that they have consider those options and are applying those options that make sense in their environment. And then furthermore, they need to provide those options to the students. So and the waiver is only offered on an individual student basis. So you need to consider each option, implement those that make sense at the district level, and then also implement them with individual students. I'm actually, before I go into application process, I do want to just pause for a moment and see if there are questions back.
Randy, there was this is Helene Paroff from WASA. There was a question that about grading for high school and for students in junior high that are taking Jump Start, high school credit courses in junior high, all about grading. So do you want to just take a moment to address state board function as it does or does not relate to grading?
Yeah, so grading so the board does not have a role in sort of grading policies, but there are, I think it's worth pointing out, and I appreciate the question because it prompted something for me here. So when we look at On Track, note that this is all about enrollment and enrollment plans. We do not reference grades. And we did get this question as we were developing the rules. So if it has a lot to do with the timing of this. If a student on February 29th wasn't passing the class, we did not want to say that student was off track because there's a lot of time between February and June to make that up, and many students do. That was the feedback we had received. So we didn't want to put grade in that way. The other place grading comes in is in this good faith effort. And so one of the strategies that OSPI points to is that a district may want to consider doing a credit, no credit, or pass, not pass kind of a model. And those are options that would be available from the state board perspective. It would still meet requirements. There may be other reasons that a district may want to consider about whether or not that makes sense to do, things like NCAA eligibility, or how it would count if it's a dual credit course, as you mentioned, or some of the other kinds of, there may be other implications for that grading option that would have to come into it, but from the state board perspective, in terms of meeting requirements, that would meet requirements.
Okay, Randy, right before you go on to the next slide, let me ask another question. It came in from Sarah Rich. The question is about how the expedited assessment appeals waivers would work if a student had waived credit. OSPI's guidance says that for a student to be eligible to apply for an appeal, they must have completed all other applicable graduation requirements. For example, all graduation credits, high school and beyond plan, etc. So if a student had waived credits in alignment with the state board's rules, would that make them ineligible for the EAA? And thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, this question has come up a couple of times as well. And from the again, our perspective on this is that the waiver is would allow the determination to be that the student has met the requirements. So if the requirement is waived, then they would be considered to have met the graduation requirement in terms of credits. Can't speak to the other requirements, but the credit requirement. That is how we treat other similar kinds of waivers.
Great. Those are the only questions right now. So I'll continue to monitor the chat box and if you wanted to move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, and so application process, I spoke about this a moment ago, but just to be clear, the application is launched. It's in the iGrants or EDS system. So the appropriate personnel in each district should be able to access that and submit it. We're going to have a special board meeting on the 21st, which will be a review of those applications, and it'll be a pretty narrowly focused meeting to do that review. And then following that, we anticipate that those applications would go on a rolling basis after that. And our hope is to be able to turn those around fairly quickly on about a 3 to 5 day business day kind of turnaround is what our goal is for that. And the other thing, again, because I've mentioned this a couple of times, but the authority for this waiver ends on the 31st of July. Now, theoretically, we could approve an application on the 31st of July, but that wouldn't give the district time to actually grant any students waivers. So we are anticipating that we would like to set a relatively soft deadline around the 19th of June, which is the scheduled end of the term or of the closure period, so that we can be sure that districts have the authority they need in order to process any student applications they need to address.
Okay, Randy, I'm going to interrupt with 2 questions and then
Sure.
let you move forward. So one is from Emily Harrison, who says our school district sometimes enrolls students in credit recovery later in the spring semester. Can we allow students to waive those credits even though it is not a new term? So that's one question, and then I'll read you the second question.
Yeah, so that it starts to get complicated there, but I think if it's in the student's credit recovery plan, then that's probably a yes. The other thing is any waive credits would have to happen during the time of closure. So it kind of depends also on the calendar and whether schools open again a little bit.
Great. And I'm guessing that anybody can follow up with state board staff post Zoom meeting to get further clarification of some situations. So the second question is from Lisa Cadero Smith, and she asks, how does the new waiver process impact districts who are in their last year of a 22 credit graduation requirement, last year on a 24 credit waiver? Is there a minimum number of credits that must be obtained to achieve a diploma?
So the short answer on the last part of that question is no, but that what can be waived has to be connected to what the student was currently enrolled in or planned to be enrolled in. That's sort of the limiting factor on that. But for those districts that had the waiver from the 24 credit or the delay of implementation of the 24 credits, they too are eligible for this waiver. And actually the difference is they have a little bit less flexibility in some ways because they don't have access to the 2 credit waiver that the schools that implemented the 24 had access to. Okay, so if it's okay, I'll go on to the application process. I mentioned this is an EDS. There's a very blurry image to the right of what the application looks like. It is a short application. There are 4 questions, and the questions are asking for the certifying official, which is typically the superintendent, to address whether that to essentially affirm that the district has considered equity in applying for the waiver and will consider it in administering the waiver, and give some examples. There's a little bit more detail when you look in the rules about what that means, especially on the administering side. There's also some guidance in the documents that we referenced for the good faith effort that OSPI provided about equity. So those are some additional resources for that. Local education agency will be granting these on an individual student basis, so that is a requirement for the waiver, and that's that's a critical piece. These are not blanket waivers for an entire class, and the LEA has to make that good faith effort, which basically is we're gonna try to get students to earn or demonstrate the credit before we consider a waiver. And then finally, I'll follow all the rules. And so you want to read the full chapter, but it's the catch-all to say that you're going to follow the rules for the waiver. So certifying those 4 things and then signing it is basically what's required to apply. And then we will process those. There is a text box in the application. So if you say no to any of the questions, we're not going to be able to approve it, but it would allow you to ask a question or describe what challenge you're facing on that issue. And then we could, staff would reach out and work with the district to figure out how to get you to a yes.
Randy, before again you go on, if you could restate the answer to the question regarding 22 credit graduation requirement and last year on a 24 credit waiver. And then the second part of that was, is there a minimum number of credits that must be obtained to achieve a diploma? So yeah, if you could go back to that question, that would be much appreciated.
Sure, I will try again, and if I don't do it, I think Linda Drake is also on the phone, so, or on the call. But so let me back up because I think I confuse things, and we tend to do that with talking about the 2 credit waivers. So schools that have implemented the 24 credits have access already to a 2 credit waiver of requirements that's built into that statute. Students that had the delay of implementation technically don't have that requirement, but if they're doing 22, they can locally waive 2 because the previous one was actually 20 credit state requirement. So that's why it gets complicated. So I apologize for confusing it further with that explanation. But in terms of, is there a minimum number? No is the answer. So the limiting factor on what can be waived, and we'll come to that in the next section a little bit more detail. The limiting factor is what was the student enrolled in and what was in their planned enrollment. And I think there's also a sort of a reasonable test. If you said the student's going to finish 12 of their 20 credits in the next 2 terms, I would probably suggest that may or may not be reasonable, and you may want to question whether or not you want to waive 12 credits. But but it does come down to that plan. So does that help?
I think.
Okay.
Go on, Randy.
Okay, so so this is leading into what is the process for using the waiver. So once the board approves the application, then the LEA is the one who would be waiving credits for individual students. And so there will be some reporting requirements. We're still working with OSPI on the most seamless way to do that, but the board is not going to be seeing individual student waivers. It's the district's authority to do those waivers at that point in time. It does apply to classes prior to 2020. It does not apply to classes after 2020. So if you had a 5th year student who was also planning to complete this year, you could use the waiver authority to help that student get across the stage as well. Virtual stage, I guess, this year. But and then as I mentioned before, the first and preferred option is to help students earn credit, and that goes back to that good faith effort and those strategies that districts might employ to get students to the credit. There's also a requirement around the student being involved in this decision. That this is a choice that the student has to be aware of. There are potential implications for students who accept a waiver that may have consequences that they should at least be aware of, sort of an informed decision-making model here. So it should be very clear about what's being waived and then what the potential impacts of that might be. And then the student can choose not to accept the waiver and instead continue and receive instruction at a later time. So those are the options for that piece. And in particular on this, you know, there may be situations where it's a little bit of both too. So this is the other thing. Summer is a nice, it adds an option as well, which is you might have a student who has 6 classes in spring. 5 of those classes are not critical for his or her post-secondary plans, but one really is. And so that might be a situation where that student might want those 5 classes waived, but the one class he or she might want to take in the summer or find some other way to earn the credit or something along those lines. So that could be a situation that presents itself.
So here are a couple of other questions that have come in. So what it says is the waiver mainly applies to elective credits like work experience that began on June 30th or a yearbook class that began on on January 30th. Are those examples?
So the waiver actually could apply to either core or elective credits, and that's one of the things that's different than other waivers that we have available. But the consequences might be different, or the implications for a given student might be different in core versus elective credit. Although in some cases it might be the elective that student really wants to finish. That is what's different about this, is it does allow for that waiver of core.
Okay, so just a couple of other questions. Will districts need to have a policy that supports the waiver, or is there a resolution being developed by WASA? So any guidance there?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for WASDA, but I do know they've been in touch with us and they are working on some policy guidance for this. I don't know whether it's a sample policy or a resolution, or the form of that exactly, but I know that they're going to be coming out with that, I think, fairly quickly.
Terrific. Then just 2 short questions. Is there a limit on the number of waivers the LEA may grant for a student?
Number of waivers for an individual student, no, I think is the answer if I understand it right. But I think this waiver, you could waive multiple courses with one waiver. We do in the rule, it may be confusing. It's a little bit stacked because districts already have authority for some other kinds of waivers or other kinds of flexibility, and we call those out in the rule. And so you may not need to access this waiver, for example, to excuse a student from PE, or to or if all they need is a waiver within that 2 credits that's already available in most districts.
Okay, and then and somebody recalls that Tim Garshow had said that it would be in resolution, but I think it's fair to say we'll be hearing from WASDA shortly about that. And then MJ Bolt has added the FAQ document for the rules and added that, and that somebody asked the question, and then I want to let you finish. So I'm going to take a body of questions now, let you go on, and then do another body of questions. So another question was, do you know the name of the application that it can be found in EDS or SBI?
I wrote the number down, and it's form, I think, Parker, I'm going to let you speak. Form package something, and I forgot the number. So
we can circle back to that and make sure that before people get off that we have the form package. So not to worry. Yeah. Maybe somebody can add that into the chat box. One of the questions is, are you suggesting that classes students are enrolled in at the time of closure should be waived instead of granting credit?
Those would be eligible for waiver, but the preference would be to see if you can get the student the credit first. And so I think using that's again that good faith effort. The first attempt should be to try to get the student the credit in one form or another, and if that doesn't work, then the waiver is the backup plan.
Great. And we know most assuredly that the form package is 956. So I'm going to let you go on and mute.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about this in terms of administering the waiver. So equity comes up twice. We want to see at the front end when the application is reviewed that that the district has considered equity. Also, we want the districts to kind of have this ongoing evaluation as they're implementing these to see, is this, are we seeing disparate impacts, and are there ways we might be able to mitigate that as we go through and administer these waivers. So it's really just wanting districts to be mindful as they administer this of potential to impact some groups of students more than others. And then there is a requirement to maintain records of this. We're working with OSPI. We're hoping there's going to be a way to reflect this on the transcript or otherwise in the student level data systems, but that's sort of more to come on that piece as well. But at the end of the day, we know that we're going to get asked a lot of questions about how this was used. We're going to want to make sure that we can be responsive to that, and so that's the purpose behind this. So what can be waived? I think we've touched on most of this, but the limit on what can be waived is based on their enrollment and their plan, and that the requirements can include both core and flexible credits. I should say it's during the time of closure. And so the other thing that could come up is, at least in terms of your current planning, if the building closures end on the 19th of June, according to the current governor's order. And so you may anticipate that summer, or should anticipate that summer is going to happen. So if you have I wouldn't suggest that you would want to count on waiving spring and summer courses, but instead be thinking that you could waive some of the spring courses, but those summer courses, at least at this point, might want to anticipate that the student would still be required to complete those. And then what does the waiver not do? And so we got a lot of questions as we were sharing this, and we do not have the ability with this waiver to address the freshmen, sophomore, and juniors in your current high school class. We will be talking about that over the interim to see what kind of flexibility might be appropriate for those students. It does not apply to local graduation requirements, but that's because the local districts have that authority already. So we don't give you authority to waive your local requirements. You have that authority already, and so and may need to do that to help meet student needs. And it also doesn't address missed hours or days, and that's OSPI provides the guidance and the appropriate waivers for those issues. And I think, oh, there's more. What does it not do? Oh, yes, of course. And so then other things that have come up, graduation pathway options are not waived through this waiver, and there isn't really an option to waive it, but there is the expedited appeal process, which can help students meet those graduation requirements. That too is through OSPI. And so if a student is not able to meet one of their pathway options because they didn't have a passing score on an assessment, or they couldn't finish their CTE series or something along those lines, then they may want to seek the expedited appeal as their option to meet that requirement. High school and beyond plan, we think students should be able to complete, even though there have been some new requirements added. That should be something that could be done with students remotely and should be able to be completed. And we mentioned 9th, 10th, and 11th grade is not covered. And then there is a link here to the OSPI guidance related to the expedited appeal.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with 3 more questions, Randy.
Okay, sure.
One question was, is there a release date, kind of with some quotation marks around it, for seniors for whom we've applied for the waiver? In small districts, the May and June counts represent a significant amount of revenue.
Oh, that is not a question I can answer. I know there are some questions around funding, and that is an OSPI question.
Okay, and we'll make sure that OSPI is also aware and can respond to questions as well. The next question is about, does the waiver apply to Washington State history, even though that's a non-credit requirement? It is still generally a course.
Yeah, that's something that we got questions on, and I don't think we included it in our FAQ, but it did come up. But our answer is yes. If a student is meeting that in high school, then that we would consider that to be a credit and therefore waivable. Most students meet it before high school, and then there's already some exceptions built in for juniors and seniors who are out of state prior to that. So, yeah.
And then one other question about how does this affect students who are enrolled in bridge to college courses to meet ELA or math assessment requirements?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well. Might depend on decisions that are made at the local level around grading options, because to meet the assessment requirements, typically those courses require that you get a particular grade. I do know that the folks that have worked on Bridge to College are having that conversation as well. So I think that's another one I would have to bounce, but I know that conversation is happening right now. Other questions? I think this is my questions, and I do have the link to the FAQ on here as well. It sounded like MJ might have already pasted that into chat, but it is up on our website. The application is available in the EDS system, and they've already been coming in. So not a surprise. People are eager to move forward on this.
Right. I'd like to go back and just re-clarify a question about Washington State history. And so if a student takes Washington State history online, can that be waived?
I don't think we've thought of it in that way. So if Linda Drake's on the phone, I wonder to see if she has some, we might have to have more conversation about that. If it was intended to be an online course and it's already being and it's continuing to be delivered, that feels like that's part of the good faith effort side of it, not the waiver side of it, but I might be missing something in that.
This is Linda, and I don't think I really have anything to add. I think that Washington State history, if it is being taken by a senior and is needed to graduate, it is eligible for the waiver, right?
Yeah, I think what we hadn't considered in that is if the student was enrolled in an online course, can that online course be waived? So that's the bigger question that I don't think we had considered. I assume that instruction is continuing. So that might be a local decision.
Well, I guess the question that I have is, will the FAQ be ever evolving so that as different issues come up here, that you might be able to add some clarity around things like Washington State history? There are a number of questions about about the 90 hours, and even though some students take it 7th or 8th grade. So it seems to me Washington State history might be one of those topics that needs further clarification along the way. The other one is about the Bridge to College courses and the students who are enrolled in that. And so one of the questions is about who might those students be, or that there are folks who are working on that. Are those your staff at the state board who are working on coming to an understanding about Bridge to College?
Yeah, sorry. So who I've heard talking about it, let me start there. Bridge to College has had a lot of involvement from the community colleges and from OSPI. So there's the ones that sort of own that course. And so I want to defer to them. So it'd be OSPI staff and community college staff. So who's been on the calls has been Bill Moore, who's been very much involved in that course. But I think it's, I'm not, Linda, do you know who the OSPI staff that are on that piece are?
The name slips my mind right now.
Sorry about that. Put you on the spot. I apologize.
So here's another question.
Oh, I think it would probably be Arlene Crum.
Okay, thanks.
So another question that was asked was about students who have been accepted to a college but have not passed SBAC, and any consideration about those seniors.
So that they should be, if that's the only way they were going to meet a high school, one of the graduation pathways was SBAC, then that student probably would be eligible under the expedited appeal process. So that I think that's what I point to for that. A lot of those students, you know, there might be other pathways too, though, that the student could meet to hit the graduation requirement.
Okay, if you're good with this, I'm going to continue asking some questions that are in the chat box.
Sure thing.
There's one that says, if a student was on track to graduate, if they passed their current 6 courses and completed 2 credit retrieval courses, does the district have the ability to waive the credit retrieval and make the good faith effort to help them earn credit in currently enrolled classes or courses?
I think the short answer is yes, with the caveat I would put in there is assuming those retrieval courses were anticipated to be completed within the school year.
Then next question, there are students who had already failed courses prior to this semester and staying on track required success in this semester and beyond. Why would the waiver not apply for these underclassmen who will now be impacted and potentially off track by multiple credits?
So this is a student.
Oops,
There's some
somebody-
crosstalk there.
Okay. I think if there are those who are not muted, if you could please mute. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that on that one, to make sure I'm answering the question that was asked, if it's a student who is not in the 2020 cohort, but it's in the 2021 cohort, for example, that was by law. We can't extend it to those students. If it's someone who's behind in credits but is part of the 2020 cohort, that one might be if, again, that student was reasonably expected to complete within the school year.
And there was a request for you to re-clarify the graduation pathways statement that you made.
Is this in reference to the SBAC score question?
I believe it is.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that, you know, in many cases, students who are accepted to college may meet more than one pathway. And so if the lack of an acceptable SBAC score is the only thing, only one of the pathways the student met, then they would probably need to seek the expedited appeal. But if it's a situation where they've met one of the other criteria within or one of the other pathway criteria, then of course they could graduate. I guess what I'm saying is that SBAC is not the only way to meet the graduation requirements. There are other pathway options.
And then another question is from testing staff who want to know about students who have IEP services. with locally determined assessments rather than SBEC, and college is not the right fit, would the local assessment be waived since the students cannot be tested?
It's getting beyond, I think, my territory on the, because we're talking about the testing requirements, but I think that they would still have to either meet as one of the pathway requirements, which assessment is one of those, or do the expedited appeal.
So then, in some cases, then senior students may need to apply for both the credit waiver and the expedited appeal waiver, depending upon their situation.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think, let me do a few moments of wait time, but it seems that we're at the end of the questions. It's a good time to remind everyone that we've recorded all of the questions. We'll give the state board, Randy and his staff, an opportunity to review them, as well as touch base with OSPI. And in many cases, we have the names of those who asked. So if there's individual follow-up to do, we can certainly do that as well. It's good time to remind everybody the PowerPoint is already posted on the WASA website in the highlights section. The recording, when available, will be under the highlights section, as well as our resources section for coronavirus and pandemic resources. And I believe the state board will also be posting this website. Randy, any comments? And Joel, any comments?
I just, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation and take these questions. This is really important for us to be able to get this information out because time is of the essence on this process. And I did not respond to one of the comments you made, and I just want to say, yes, the FAQ will be an evolving document. So as we get more information and more questions, we will make those adjustments as well. So thank you.
Well, Randy, we appreciate your leadership and the state board's efforts to expedite this work. We really do appreciate that. And it can never come, clarity can never come too soon, but I think you deserve a lot of credit, and the board, as does the board, for trying to expedite this process and move it along. We recognize that there's a great deal of complexity to the work, and I want to thank you again for taking a thorough and speedy approach to providing recommendations for the state board to consider. And with that, for all of those that tuned in today, I'd like to thank you for all of your work and your extraordinary leadership during this time of unprecedented challenge. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much for tuning in today.